Imagine a capital city more populous, more systematically organized, and profoundly more pristine than any metropolis in Europe at the dawn of the 16th century. A sprawling, magnificent urban giant, built entirely upon a man-made island in the very center of a vast, shimmering, high-altitude lake. By all logic of human civilization, this city should never have existed. It was constructed by a people who possessed no beasts of burden to carry their massive stones. They had no iron tools to carve their monuments. They had no wheeled vehicles to transport their harvests. And yet, against the harshest elements of a volatile environment, they engineered an empire of water and stone that defied the imagination of everyone who eventually laid eyes upon it. They tamed a hostile, brackish swamp and transformed it into a gleaming jewel of human ingenuity. Before we drift across the mirror-like waters of this forgotten, majestic world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is as you join us on this journey into the deep past. Now, settle into your space, adjust your pillows, let your shoulders drop and take a so deep, grounding breath. Let the frantic, endless noise of the modern world fade away into the distance. Allow the cool, quiet mists of history to roll in, carrying you far back in time. Our story begins high in the mountainous, arid landscapes of North America, inside a sprawling valley surrounded by jagged, towering volcanic peaks. We follow the footsteps of a wandering tribe, a people pushed to the very edges of survival. For generations, they had been nomadic outcasts, driven further and further south by larger, established powers who fiercely guarded the fertile lands. They were forced to navigate the absolute margins of a valley dominated by hostile, deeply entrenched neighbors. Eventually, these exhausted wanderers were pushed into the only place no one else wanted, the marshy, inhospitable, and deeply muddy shallows of Lake Texcoco. It was a muddy archipelago, surrounded by shallow, brackish water that was unfit for drinking and difficult to navigate. The air was thick with mosquitoes, and the ground was too soft to support even a simple wooden hut, let alone a civilization. But where the rest of the valley saw a useless, sinking wasteland, these weary wanderers saw something else entirely. They saw the ultimate impenetrable fortress. The water, they realized, would be their walls. The mud would be their foundation. If they could somehow master this fluid, shifting environment, they would never again be driven from their homes. And so began one of the most audacious engineering projects in the history of humankind. To build a city upon sinking mud, they had to invent entirely new ways to manipulate the earth itself. The lake bed was deep and treacherous. If they simply piled rocks into the water, the heavy stones would sink without a trace, swallowed by the endless silt. They needed to find solid ground beneath the water. Their engineers devised a brilliant, back-breaking solution. Using sharpened obsidian blades and axes made of hard stone, they felled thousands upon thousands of thick, straight trees from the distant mainland forests. They dragged these massive logs through the marshes and waded chest-deep into the cold lake water. With rhythmic, unified precision, Teams of men drove these massive wooden stakes deep into the lake bed, pounding them down through the soft mud until they finally struck the hard, solid clay deep beneath the surface. They drove these pilings in incredibly dense grids, creating a vast subterranean forest of wooden pillars. Once the wooden foundations were perfectly leveled and secure, they began the arduous process of creating land. They loaded flat-bottom wooden canoes with a lightweight, porous volcanic rock known as tezontel. This red, jagged stone was incredibly strong but light enough not to sink the wooden pilings. They layered the tezontel over the wooden stakes, locking them together with thick, sticky clay dredged from the lake bottom. Day by day, year by year, inch by inch, a flat, solid expanse of artificial land began to emerge cleanly from the surface of the lake. They were quite literally building an island from scratch. But an expanding foundation of rock and clay could not sustain a growing population. The people needed food, and their beautiful new island offered absolutely no arable soil for crops. To survive, they had to look back to the water. If they could not find farmland, they would engineer it. This necessity gave birth to the Immerse, the legendary floating gardens. The agricultural engineers of the city wove giant, rectangular webs of thick, buoyant reeds, creating massive floating rafts that bobbed on the gentle ripples of the lake. To prevent these massive rafts from drifting away in the wind, they planted tall, fast-growing willow trees at the corners. The roots of the willow trees grew rapidly, reaching down through the water and plunging into the lake floor, anchoring the floating gardens permanently in place while forming natural living fences. Next, workers in small wooden canoes tirelessly dredged the bottom of the lake, pulling up heavy, incredibly nutrient-dense mud and decaying organic matter. They piled this black gold high onto the woven reed mats, layering it with dried vegetation until it formed a thick, rich bed of soil floating directly on the water. The Immerse were an agricultural miracle. Because they rested directly on the lake, the soil drew moisture constantly from below. They never required manual watering, even during the harsh, dry seasons. The land was so devastatingly fertile that farmers could harvest corn, beans, squash, and vibrant red tomatoes up to 7 times a single year. Soon, the shallow waters surrounding the stone city were transformed into a breathtaking geometric grid of lush, productive farmland. Narrow, perfectly straight canals of blue water separated the rectangular islands of brilliant green. It was a serene, floating breadbasket that provided endless sustenance for the booming population. With the threat of starvation eliminated, the island city expanded with explosive speed. To connect their aquatic stronghold to the distant shores of the mainland, the city's architects designed massive raised stone causeways. These were incredibly wide, perfectly straight roads built straight across the open water. These causeways were engineering marvels in their own right, constructed by driving 2 parallel lines of wooden stakes into the lake and filling the space between them with millions of tons of stone and earth. They were wide enough for 10 men to walk comfortably shoulder to shoulder. Yet the engineers never forgot the defensive value of their lake. At strategic intervals, the solid stone causeways were intentionally broken, These gaps were bridged by heavy wooden planks. In times of peace, these wooden bridges allowed the city's vast fleet of merchant canoes to pass freely between the different sections of the lake. But in times of conflict, the wooden bridges could be quickly lifted and pulled away. Instantly, the causeways became isolated islands, completely cutting off the city from mainland threats and turning the aquatic capital into a heavily fortified, unassailable island. Within the city limits, the infrastructure was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The streets were not just made of packed earth or cobblestone. Half the city's streets were made entirely of water. A complex, masterfully planned network of canals mirrored the structure of the neighborhoods. The gentle sound of water lapping against stone filled the air. Thousands of sleek, beautifully carved wooden canoes glided silently through the city, transporting building materials, fresh flowers, vegetables, and everyday citizens. The canals were the arteries of the metropolis, ensuring that no neighborhood was ever isolated. Rising from the very center of this sprawling, flat expanse of water and floating gardens were the colossal step pyramids. These structures were the architectural pride of the city. Immense artificial mountains built to echo the jagged volcanic peaks that surrounded the valley. The construction of these megalithic structures is a testament to raw human endurance. The stonemasons possessed no iron or steel. Instead, they used incredibly sharp black volcanic glass, obsidian, to painstakingly cut and shape the heavy blocks of basalt and tezontle. Without wheels, carts, or horses, the massive stones were transported from the mainland quarries on giant wooden barges. Once on the island, thousands of men used thick ropes woven from agave fibers, placing the stones on wooden rollers and pulling them in unified, rhythmic unison up massive earthen ramps. When the stone frameworks were complete, the pyramids were coated in a thick layer of brilliantly white limestone stucco. This smooth, flawless finish caught the light of the sun. As evening approached, the towering white structures would glow with a warm, radiant golden hue, casting long reflections across the mirror-like lake. At its peak, this floating city was home to well over 200,000 people. It was a sprawling, vibrant, and incredibly ordered society. It was also a marvel of urban hygiene, far cleaner than the disease-ridden, sewage-filled streets of contemporary London or Paris. Cleanliness was a cornerstone of their culture. Every single morning, long before the sun peaked over the eastern mountains, a dedicated workforce of over 1,000 street sweepers took to the plazas and causeways. With brooms made of bound twigs, they swept the stone courtyards until they were completely free of dust and debris. Waste was strictly managed. A fleet of specialized canoes navigated the canals, collecting human waste from public latrines strategically placed throughout the city. This waste was not dumped into the lake, but carefully transported out to the Chinampas, where it was used as high-grade fertilizer, closing the ecological loop perfectly. Fresh, drinkable water was a priority. Because the lake surrounding them was brackish, the engineers constructed a massive twin-pipe aqueduct that stretched for miles, carrying crystal-clear spring water from the mainland hills of Chapultepec directly into the heart of the city's public fountains. This brilliant twin pipe design meant that while one ceramic pipe was being cleaned or repaired, the other continued to flow, ensuring the city never went a single day without fresh water. Citizens bathed daily, a practice that would have shocked the nobility of Europe at the time. The true beating heart of this empire was not just its architecture, but its commerce. To the north of the main city centre lay the grand market of Tlatelolco, a sprawling, perfectly organized open-air plaza that accommodated upwards of 60,000 people every single day. The market was a sensory masterpiece. The air was heavy with the rich, intoxicating scents of roasted cacao beans, fresh vanilla pods, burning pine wood, and blooming tropical flowers. It was a place of vibrant colors and quiet, respectful negotiation. Every item had its designated street or zone. In one corner, merchants laid out brilliant green and crimson feathers from exotic jungle birds, used by artisans to weave intricate, shimmering garments. In another, goldsmiths displayed finely pounded jewelry that caught the bright midday sun. There were aisles dedicated entirely to pottery, to medicinal herbs and roots, to woven cotton textiles dyed in deep indigos and brilliant reds, and to endless varieties of food. Vendors sold fresh fish from the lake, roasted venison, sweet honey, and hundreds of varieties of chili peppers and corn. Strict order was maintained. Highly respected magistrates sat in a central pavilion, overlooking the sea of merchants. They patrolled the aisles to ensure absolute fairness in trade, guaranteeing that measures were accurate and that the quality of goods met the high standards of the city. Society within the floating city was highly structured, rewarding merit, discipline, and endurance. From a young age, children of all classes were subjected to rigorous education. They were taught the histories of their ancestors, the complex movements of the stars, the administration of justice, and the harsh realities of military discipline. For nearly 2 centuries, the floating city thrived on the calm, mirror-like waters of Lake Texcoco. It grew in wealth, power, and architectural splendor, acting as the undisputed center of gravity for the entire region. But history is rarely kind to utopias. The end of this magnificent water empire did not come from an uprising of neighboring tribes. It did not come from a failure of their brilliant engineering, nor a collapse of their agricultural miracles. The end came from the edge of the world. It came from the vast, unknown ocean. One day, sudden and incomprehensible news arrived via swift runners from the distant eastern coast. Strangers had appeared on the horizon. They arrived not in canoes, but in massive floating wooden fortresses with great white wings that caught the wind. These strangers were like nothing the people had ever seen. They wore garments of impenetrable, gleaming grey metal. They wielded weapons that thundered and spat fire. Most terrifying of all, they rode upon the backs of massive, muscular beasts, creatures of speed and power completely alien to the continent. When these armored strangers eventually marched over the high mountain passes and looked down into the valley of Lake Texcoco, they fell to their knees. They believed they were looking at a dream. Before them lay a sprawling metropolis of silver and white, hovering impossibly upon the blue waters of the lake, connected by arrow-straight threads of stone. But the awe of the strangers soon gave way to an insatiable greed for the city's gold and resources. What followed was a tragic collision of worlds. Through cunning political manipulation, the forging of alliances with resentful rival tribes, and the accidental introduction of devastating, invisible diseases, the strangers laid siege to the floating capital. The brilliant city of water and stone endured a horrific, grueling blockade. The strangers cut the aqueducts, depriving the people of fresh water. They launched boats with cannons into the lake, bombarding the beautiful white pyramids. Despite a ferocious, desperate defense by the city's warriors, the empire was slowly starved and battered into submission. When the city finally fell, the destruction was absolute. The great pyramids were dismantled stone by stone, their blocks used to build European-style churches and palaces. The intricate canals were filled with rubble. Over the centuries, the glorious lake itself was drained away, lost to the march of a new era. Today, the misty mornings, the vibrant floating gardens, and the silent, gliding wooden canoes are completely gone. A dense, modern, sprawling megacity of concrete and asphalt now sits heavily upon the dry, dusty remnants of that ancient, brilliant lake bed. But beneath the pavement, the spirit of the water empire remains. If you close your eyes, you can still see it in your mind. The pristine capital, glowing white and gold in the evening sun. A testament to pure human endurance. A city built by wandering outcasts who took a muddy swamp and engineered it into one of the greatest marvels in human history. As you drift into sleep tonight, let your mind float along those tranquil ancient canals. Listen to the soft dip of a wooden paddle in the water. Feel the cool evening breeze off the lake, and let the magnificent floating city drift softly and peacefully into your dreams. If you found this interesting, please subscribe and give us a like so we can create even more exciting stories.